Sauropod dinosaurs were the biggest animals to ever walk on land, and to an absurd degree. This is a human next to a rhino, now the world record bull African bush elephant. And this is Brachiosaurus altathorax, which at 45 tons and 15 meters tall is the weight of 7.5 of these elephants, and as tall as 2.5 average male giraffes. The kicker, Brachiosaurus was far from the biggest sauropod, although it seems unbelievably huge to our modern sensibilities. In this video, we'll talk about the biggest of the big, the titans of the titans, the Megasauropods. Before diving into the I really like big numbers part of the video, let's learn some basics about sauropod evolution and what makes them such a unique group. We're all familiar with the stereotypical sauropod or long neck body plan. A huge body, elongated neck and tail with a tiny head, and 4 columnar legs that you could be forgiven for mistaking for tree trunks. But this wasn't always how they looked. The early sauropod ancestors, sauropodomorphs from the Triassic Period, were actually bipedal. Our current understanding of their skeletal morphology indicates that sauropods and theropods, the group that includes most carnivorous dinosaurs like Utahraptor and Spinosaurus, share a common ancestor that split off from the rest of the dinosaurs. This means that Diplodocus and T-Rex are more closely related to one another than Diplodocus is to Triceratops. The very first saurischian dinosaurs, the lizard-hipped group that both theropods and sauropods belong to, may have looked something like Herrerasaurus, bipedal, with long, clawed arms and sharp teeth. We see the theropods dive deep into that build, while the sauropods, on the other evolutionary branch, use their sharp teeth not for cutting flesh, but cutting leaves. The earliest sauropodomorphs, like Chromogisaurus, superficially looked like tiny theropods, with only small differences in the skeleton. Later Triassic sauropodomorphs, like Plateosaurus, resemble a cross between a theropod and sauropod, with their bipedal stance, powerful clawed forelimbs, and long, but not unreasonably long, neck. The early Jurassic period gave us Massospondylus, with a theropod silhouette but sauropod-like skull. Melanorosaurus was another early Jurassic form that looks more like the long necks we know and love, with its quadrupedal stance and long neck with a tiny head. It's sometime in the late Jurassic when true sauropods dominate the planet. Shunosaurus is an example of one of these forms, with its classic silhouette and club tail. Mamenchisaurids, like the titular Mamenchisaurus, went all in on the uber-extended neck build. Neosauropods are a group that includes most of the famous ones we know, including the ridge-backed Rabacosaurids, funky-sailed Dicraeosaurs like Amargasaurus and Bahatasaurus, and the iconic Morrison formation Diplodocids like Apatosaurus, Barosaurus, and Diplodocus itself. Coexisting with them were early macronarians like Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, two household names with iconic helmet-shaped skulls. That line gave rise to the biggest sauropod group of all, the Titanosaurs, which dominated the Cretaceous and included juggernauts like Dreadnoughtus, Patagotitan, and Argentinosaurus. This deserves a disclaimer. Given the fragmentary nature of sauropods and how fragile their typically diagnostic skulls are, sauropod phylogeny is quite unstable. A recent abstract by Paul Serino and Daniel Vidal discussed the issue with titanosaurs in particular, which are infamous for having poorly understood evolutionary relationships with one another. As such, many of the smaller scale classifications are subject to change and likely will. Now that we have a very broad overview of sauropod classification, let's start with the honorable mentions. A megasauropod is defined as a sauropod dinosaur that contains specimens reaching 40 metric tons or more, so this category is for those who don't quite make the cut. As is tradition with these evolving lists, each animal will receive a Jerry score, or how many 6-ton African bush elephant bulls it takes to equal the mass of a single one of these sauropods. Alamosaurus sanjuanensis is one of my very favorite sauropods, so I feel that I have to put it in the honorable mentions. Apart from my personal bias, it is legitimately enormous, with the largest specimens in the 28-meter and 38-ton range. Some specimens even preserve impressive osteoderms, bony spikes, that may have been used for calcium storage as well as display. It is the only sauropod known to have coexisted with Tyrannosaurus rex in the North Horn Formation and possibly the Javelina Formation. Unfortunately, the holotype, or original specimen for Alamosaurus, is an incomplete scapula, so the referred specimens may or may not belong to the same genus. Like I said, sauropod phylogeny is messy. Xinjiang Titan Shenshanisis may be smaller than Alamosaurus at only 32 tons, but it's quite well preserved and is famous for having the longest complete neck of any animal ever. As in, the neck alone is 50 feet long. Looking at the skeleton makes me feel like we're significantly underestimating the soft tissue levels on sauropod torsos, limbs, and tails just from a counterbalance perspective. It's likely that every animal on this list is several tons heavier than I have them here, as indicated by a recent study on dinosaur soft tissue levels by Dr. Matt Dempsey and his team. Onto the Stomper class, which includes sauropods between 40 and 50 tons. These are the first true megasauropods of the ranking, and at adult sizes would have been nearly invulnerable to predation. When you weigh the same as a half dozen African elephant bulls, the only thing you need to worry about is other members of your kind. Utahraptor hebora is from late Cretaceous Brazil and is known for multiple specimens, a rare condition for a giant titanosaur. While no skulls were found, a condition that is not rare for giant titanosaurs, the 5 known specimens represent multiple age groups, with the biggest at about 40 tons. Mamenchisaurus sinocanidorum was one of the largest mamenchisaurids, dating back to the heyday of the non-titanosaur sauropods, the late Jurassic. There are multiple specimens of Mamenchisaurus, famous for their long necks in proportion to their bodies, but the biggest specimen actually doesn't technically overlap with the holotype for M. sinocanidorum. It's only included here as a matter of convenience. These 2 enormous cervical or neck vertebrae would scale to a 30-meter long animal that weighs about 40 tons. Brachiosaurus altathorax, the childhood classic, the sauropod that many first encountered through the first Jurassic Park film. In many ways, Brachiosaurus represents the archetypal sauropod, not just in morphology, but body mass. With specimens in the 45-ton range, it has an impressive Jerry score of 7.6, as in this guy weighed the same as 7.5 bull-bush elephants and stood about 14 meters tall at the head. Like most other sauropods, it would have used its tiny skull to shovel down plant matter without chewing it, leaving the chemical breakdown of food to the vat of bacteria in its large gut. Sauroposeidon protelles. What could surpass the arm lizard? Try the Poseidon lizard. Named after the Greek god of oceans, horses, and earthquakes, Sauroposeidon was an early Cretaceous giant from the southwestern United States. It may be the tallest animal in the known history of the world, able to hold its head as high as 17 meters or 56 feet in the air. Interesting how it resembles the late Jurassic brachiosaur-like forms in an age when titanosaurs were getting most of the evolutionary press. It makes you wonder about what part of the puzzle we're missing. Giraffatitan branchi was once thought to be a species of Brachiosaurus, but later re-examination of the skeleton determined it was its own genus entirely. The giraffe titan of Tanzania lived in the late Jurassic, and while not as tall as the similarly built Sauroposeidon, was even heavier at 48 tons. The skeleton is on display in Berlin and is remarkably complete. Almost the entire animal was preserved, including the infamously fragile skull. The King Killer class brings us to the 50 to 60 ton range, where it's difficult to comprehend living things walking on land at this scale. Phaseosaurus jowii, a titanosauriform from early Cretaceous China, is one of those almost unbelievably huge animals. Little is known about it, unfortunately, beyond the measurements of its bones. Dreadnoughtus shrani was touted after its discovery for being the largest animal to ever walk. It definitely wasn't, but at over 50 tons it was still on a different level from modern land animals. It would have been a dreadnought indeed, big enough as an adult to simply ignore most predators. While not quite as tall as earlier macronarians like Sauroposeidon, given the angle of its neck, it was still 12 meters high at the head. You know, no biggie. Ruyangosaurus giganteus was yet another Chinese giant. The early Cretaceous was a hotbed for these critters and seemingly had very few, if any, predators capable of taking them down. We didn't see truly gigantic, well-preserved carnivorous dinosaurs in Cretaceous China until towards the end of the period, when elephant-sized hunters like Zhusheng tyrannus showed up. Ruyangosaurus wasn't the only giant herbivore in its environment either, coexisting with other admittedly smaller sauropods like Zinshanosaurus. The AC Turriosaur is an unpublished giant from France. That is pretty much all there is to know about it at this point in time, but if I find out more, I'll let you know. Patagotitan majorum. Known from 6 specimens of varying sizes and ages, it's one of the best known titanosaurs and was discovered only 16 years ago. It lived in an environment with gigantic trees and had a robust torso, perfect for holding digestive organs to process the enormous amount of leaves it was taking in on a daily basis. The fact that the 6 specimens were preserved together may indicate herd behavior. Such a troop would not have had much to worry about, apart from maybe eating their way out of the ecosystem. You may have heard of the Oklahoma giant, OMNH 1670, some type of apatosaurine, possibly an apatosaurus. It's known only from an enormous dorsal vertebra. Depending on the apatosaurine you scale it from, you can get it anywhere from 50 to 60 tons, so we're going with the lower end to be safe. This was the apex herbivore of the Kenton layer of the Morrison Formation, possibly coexisting with and likely terrifying Allosaurus annex. Supersaurus vivianae is much more lightly built than robust thick apatosaurines like the Oklahoma giant. So how is it even heavier? Well, the biggest specimen scales to a nearly 40-meter animal for one, potentially making it the longest vertebrate from Earth's long and storied history of large vertebrates. One smaller specimen of Supersaurus was analyzed in a study on bone structure, which concluded that the animal was so old they couldn't tell how old it was. I always liked the idea of incredibly ancient enormous sauropods running around like wise elders. perhaps science bears that image out. The Shishigoma-menchiosaurid is an unnamed, uncatalogued cervical vert from a 2002 publication. Seems like giant cervical verts end up resulting in a weird number of gigantic early Cretaceous Chinese sauropods. Maybe I should make a joke about nickels. If you're watching this video, odds are you've heard about the Candelaros monster. This is the giant yet currently undescribed titanosaur that lived alongside Giganotosaurus, although, given the presence of smaller titanosaurs in the formation, likely didn't form the bulk of Giga's diet. The Candelaros monster was too big for any theropod to hunt, at least in a one-on-one encounter, at 30 meters long and 59 tons. While the Giganotosaurus could likely take on 6-ton Jerry in a random encounter without too much difficulty, killing an animal 10 times that size is a totally different question. The disaster class brings us to the next level, with 60 to 70 ton animals. A single disaster class Megasauropod would have the ecological impact of an entire herd of elephants. Plateosaurus ruelli continues the trend of absolutely ridiculously huge sauropods coming from either early Cretaceous China or late Cretaceous Argentina. Plateosaurus falls into the latter category and has the widest dorsal vertebra of any known sauropod. I do find it funny that it lived alongside Dreadnoughtus and was the more dreadnought-ish of the two when it comes to raw body size. Neither of them were pushovers, however. Kenya Titan is the informal nickname for an enormous saltosaurid from, well, Kenya, known only from an enormous caudal vertebra. I'm all about different continents having their own representative giants, so this is great news for me. Kenya Titan pushes the scales at nearly 70 tons and 34 meters or 11 feet long, making it perhaps the largest hobbit that the world has ever seen. Yet even this fragmentary beastie pales in comparison to the single entry in the next and final tier. The Kaiju class is appropriately named, reserved for sauropods with specimens massing 70 tons or more. Animals in the Kaiju class would look at even the biggest megatheropods in the same way a human looks at an ankle-biting dog, as something to be punted, not feared. And in this edition of the Megasauropod tier list, we only have a single entry in the Kaiju class, one that most of you will not be surprised by. But first, we should address the lost fragmentary giants in the room. I've had Marapunisaurus and Fangorn on previous editions of the list with heavy disclaimers, but this time around I decided not to include them even in the honorable mentions. Marapunisaurus is known only from a drawing of a disintegrated vertebra, while Fangorn, previously known as Bruhathkeosaurus, has drawings, angled photos, and field measurements. Marapunisaurus is entirely unverifiable, and while Fangorn's material and provenance is more stable, the identification of the elements is shaky at best. That leaves the people's champion, Argentinosaurus winkelensis. Amazing how after all these years it remains the top dog. It's like the Tyrannosaurus of sauropods in that regard. To paraphrase my friend Eric, it's not a question of if Argentinosaurus is the biggest sauropod, it's a question of by how much. The most recent volumetric estimates based on the Argentinosaurus holotype material and scaling up the gaps using Patagotitan arrive at a 33.5 meter behemoth with a mass range of 92 to 103 metric tons. That's an average of 97.5 tons, over 16 times the size of Jerry the African elephant. The thing could hold Jerry in its stomach and still have room for dessert. Thank heavens it wasn't carnivorous. While I certainly wouldn't turn down the discovery of an even bigger sauropod, the mega monster we all dreamed about as kids isn't some obscure fragment that disintegrated decades ago. It's right here. Maybe the real treasure was the gigantic Argentinosaurus we found along the way. You can check out the most recent edition of the Megatheropod list on the channel, as well as the Mega Beasts, which compiles gigantic mammalian carnivores from prehistory. Let me know if you'd be interested in a biggest non-sauropod dinosaur list. We've got to give hadrosaurs their due at some point, right? I'm the Vividen, and I'll see you the next time I make an arbitrary mass-based tier list for extinct megafauna.